Chess friends, I hope you are doing well. Yesterday, I was very busy, which is why I didn't upload any chess videos on my channel, but today, I have a very exciting and astonishing match between me and LeelaZero. As you know, LeelaZero is the world's strongest chess computer. This game is very exciting, as I even sacrifice my 2 rooks against it, so let's get started without wasting any time. I started the game with e4 and she responded with g6. Intending to place a strong bishop on g7 where it can dominate the central squares, after d4, to control and access the center with my 2 pawns, she responded with bishop to g7 and a6. The idea behind the a6 move is to prevent any sort of attack on b5, where it can potentially target the knight on c6. Alternatively, she can also push her pawn to b5, followed by bishop e7 to create some pressure in the center, and d6 followed by e5 is also a popular choice. After knight f3 d6 occurred in the game. It became clear that she wanted to play knight d7 to prepare for pushing the pawn to e5, supported by the bishop from g7. After bishop e2 knight d7 and e6 happened in the game, you can see that these 2 small central pawns are trying to protect and control the center, preventing any knight attacks. Additionally, the bishop on the knight square cannot go to c4, where it might create potential attacks through this diagonal along with the bishop on f4. The 2 bishops become very paralyzed because of this small centralized defense, allowing her to play the knight to e7. She is playing very well. I appreciate her playing style. This is known as a small centered defense. So, after bishop b3 happened in the game, my plan was to play queen d2, creating a queen-bishop battery to plant the bishop on h6 to eliminate the dark square bishop. Do you understand what I am trying to convey? After knight d7 and queen d2, preparing for bishop h6, so she responded with pawn to h6. This prevents the bishop from reaching that square because the pawn is well protected and also secures the g5 square, preventing the knight from weakening the center structure. This is why the bishop on c4 is not viable for gaining access and creating a burdensome pawn structure, as the bishop cannot go there. Additionally, the knight on h4 is useless because the pawns are protecting and securing their squares and the kingside very well. After bishop e2 to d3 happened in the game, it provided space on e2 for the knight to maneuver to g3, then, I can push my pawn to c3 to create a pawn chain along this dark square diagonal, blocking and seizing the bishop's diagonal. This made Leela angry, and she immediately struck on her queenside by pushing her pawn to b5. She intended to place her knight on b6 via c4, where it can create pressure on the bishop and queen. Additionally, she can play bishop to b7 or push her pawn to c5 to open up the center, and you know what? That c5 pawn will be well guarded by the octopus knight and the star pawn. So, after knight e2 and pawn to a4 happened to try some counterplay along with a5, creating pressure on the b5 pawn. This led to a series of captures. You can see that I brilliantly planted my rook on a4, where it can potentially move to the right side of the board in the future to create some counterplay on the king side. She responded with pawn to c5, striking the center right away. This pawn structure is great for her as it pressures my pawns on d4 and e4, with the 2 knights exerting significant pressure in the center. Some might argue to capture the pawn on c5, but it would lead to a series of piece exchanges on the c5 square, potentially opening the d-file for the queen. Additionally, you cannot push the pawn to d5 immediately because black can respond with knight b6, attacking the d5 pawn with 4 pieces, the big 4 armies. For this reason, black aims to play d5, supported by the knight, to pressure the e4 pawn with the help of the light square bishop, which can attack my 2 pieces. As I mentioned, she is putting much pressure on the d4 square, so after knight g3 and captures on d4, she continued by castling. You can see that her kingside and the e6 pawn are covering the f5 to h5 squares. My 2 knights become very useless and ineffective because, at the moment, they cannot pressure the black kingside, to strike on the kingside. I need to maneuver my dark square bishop or exchange the dark square pieces, so what should I play in this position now? I first initiated my plan by playing rook to d1, when she played a5 to protect the b4 square from any pieces. The knight on c6 can voluntarily access b4 or pressure the bishop. Her pawn structure is well protected, safeguarding her pieces and kingside. This is why the bishop on c4 still cannot access this diagonal. The structure is well organized and solid. After my bishop moves back, she took a different approach by playing knight to f6 instead of knight to c6. This exerts pressure on the e4 pawn with 2 pieces. However, I noticed that the knight is only protected by the dark square bishop. This is why I could easily capture the pawn on h6 after exchanging the knight for the bishop. I actually accomplished this in the game. The queen then moves to h6. Some of you might consider playing bishop to g7 to kick out the queen, but my queen can easily retreat to h4, exerting pressure on this diagonal, and the h-file. Others might think of playing knight c6 to offer a queen exchange. But I could easily decline it by moving my knight to g5, threatening checkmate on the h7 square. This would put the game in my favor, allowing me to control it. So let me inspire you by making a beautiful quote. The beautiful thing about letting go of what is not meant for you is that you are creating space for something more exciting and new. So, going back to the position, we saw that bishop to g7 is not viable. She responded with knight to c6, creating space for the queen to move after bishop to g7. The queen can easily move to f6. In this position, I played a very strong move. Can you imagine that move? I'll give you 6 seconds to think about it. Pause the video for 5 seconds and think about the move. The move, which you could never imagine in your whole life, is rook takes d6, sacrificing the rook right away. She accepts my rook sacrifice because she likes me and my gifts very well. Alternatively, let me show you another move, like moving the queen to a normal-looking square, such as queen to c7, instead of capturing the rook on d6. Then I can easily sacrifice another piece on the h5 square because I love to sacrifice my pieces. As a Mikhail Tal fan, I would even sacrifice my queen if necessary. After you capture my knight on h5, instead of capturing the bishop on f6, I can play a stunning move, which even strong chess players might not imagine, knight to g5, threatening checkmate on the h7 square. Honestly, this move is unimaginable because this knight can be easily captured by the bishop. After the capture, and a queen check on g5, it becomes evident that the king cannot escape through f7 because there is a barrier, forcing the king to stay in these squares. After king h8, I can easily exert another check. When the king moves, my queen will arrive again on g5, forcing the king to move. Then comes the stunning move, rook to a3, threatening checkmate on h3, with the king exposed. It will be checkmate in 6 moves with the combined forces of the queen and rook. The game will be over. So, going back to the position, we saw that you cannot capture the knight on h5, not because I will capture your bishop on f6, but because I will play knight to g5, threatening checkmate on h7, forcing you to recapture my knight. I can then plant my queen on g5, giving a check, and follow with rook a3, leading to rook h3, exerting more pressure on the king side, and the game will be potentially over. Therefore, pawn takes h5 is not viable. Some may argue to consider moving the bishop back to h8 to protect these squares voluntarily, but then comes another move, knight to g5, threatening checkmate on h7, and I think your position will be completely busted. Returning to the position, it becomes clear that you cannot safeguard your queen, which is why you have to accept my rook sacrifice, which Leela did in the game. As I told you, she likes me and my gifts very much. I then gifted her my knight on h5, again sacrificing it right away because, as I told you, g takes h5 is not possible. Alternatively, bishop to h8 is not viable, which is why she found the best move, queen to e7, with the knight and queen jointly attacking the g7 square. The knight can also come to g5, creating another threat on h7. The bishop can voluntarily come to d3, additionally pressuring the g6 pawn, followed by rook to h4, which can also decide the game. With much appreciation and many strategies involved in the game, I dare to sacrifice another pawn on e5, attacking the bishop right away to disrupt its positio. First of all, I would like to show you many variations on this position because you are my love. I mean, you are my subscribers, and I love my subscribers. First, some 1400 rated players might think of playing bishop back to h8, then knight to g5 will come with the threat of checkmating you on h7, and the game will be completely over. You might push your pawn to f5 to guard those squares, but after queen takes g6, it will be evident that your king will be paralyzed, unable to move. Your king will be paralyzed and must pay the price. So let me share a divine quote with you. Causes and results, including emotional opposites, are things that come and go. This knowledge helps you endure them all. Returning to the position, we saw that you cannot save your bishop by moving to any squares. If you dare to capture the pawn with your knight on e5, my knight is attacking your knight on e5, which is also taken by the bishop, opening the diagonal for the light square bishop. Then I can make a strategic move. Can you imagine that move? Don't just watch my video and get absorbed in chess. Pause this video and try use your unused brain. What should white play in this position now? Think a little bit. If you find knight to g5, then congratulations, you are the next Stockfish. First of all, you cannot capture the knight on h5 because it leads to a queen h7 checkmating threat right away. Additionally, you cannot capture the knight on g5 because it results in a queen g7 checkmate on the board. So, as I mentioned, g takes h5 leads to a queen h7 checkmate. It becomes clear that both knights are hanging. But you cannot capture either knight as there are two checkmating threats on the board. The best move for black is to consider rook to e8, trying to create some breathing space for the king. However, after queen h7 check, forcing the king to move, followed by another queen check and king g8, rook to f4 will come all the way from a4 to exert pressure along the f-file. The bishop and the pawn on f7 are also under pressure, making the position busted for black. For example, if you dare to capture my knight on g5, it will be checkmate on g7. Also, you cannot capture my knight on h5 because it will lead to the same checkmating pattern on h7. If you capture my knight on h5, I will respond with rook takes f6. Look at my pieces. My rook, queen, and knight are all involved in the kingside attack, and the king has no pawns to safeguard his position. It is completely lost for black. Some of you may argue that you can block all my attacks by playing knight to g6. But that won't work because I am your godfather in chess. Queen to h7 followed by rook takes f7 will lead to a loss of the queen for black and a checkmating position in the next move. The game will be over, and as the magician of chess, I will win the game. You might be the monkey, but I am the magician who makes the monkey dance. Returning to the position, we saw that you cannot safeguard your dark square bishop, nor can you capture the pawn on e5, which is why knight to g5 can ruin your position. Two knights on the kingside will create heavy attacks and strategies against the black king. Leela finds the best move because she is not a fool or a monkey-type human. She played bishop takes e5, which is the best move and protects the dark squares very well from the queen checkmating on g7. You might argue that I can easily capture the bishop on e5, threatening checkmate on g7, but black can respond with g takes h5, as your knight was also under attack, and the black king will be safeguarded. Going back to the position, we saw that even knight takes e5 is not viable, which is why I responded with the cunning strategic and bold move bishop to d3, involving the bishop in the kingside attack to target the g6 pawn. My knight is already in a strong position, and I can add another attacker on h4 along with the rook on g4. The rook can generate powerful attacks on the black king. Leela first captured my pawn on b2, and I exerted pressure on the g6 pawn by moving my rook to g4. She responded with rook to d8 to attack my bishop. At this juncture, some of you might be tempted to see that my queen and knight are exerting a lot of pressure against the black kingside due to the dark square weaknesses. Some of you might even consider sacrificing the bishop on g6, but this is a completely rubbish move, as black can respond with rook to d1, resulting in a 200 elo checkmate. As a 4000 rated engine, I must avoid such nonsense. Some of you might even consider sacrificing the rook on g6. But this is also a vulnerable move, as black can capture the rook on g6. For your information, the rank along with the bishop is well protected by the queen and bishop. So, after queen takes g6 and the king runs, knight to g5 might come with the idea of playing knight to h7 check. However, black can brilliantly counter with rook takes d3. Some of you might then play knight to h7 check, thinking the king is completely paralyzed, forcing black to sacrifice the queen on h7, but you know what? Rook to d1 is also coming, and your position will be just busted. You must first protect your king. 200 rated players might think of saving the queen and sacrifice the white king, but I am not a 200 rated player, who will sacrifice the rook or bishop on g6 for no reason. Seeing that rook takes d3 might occur, I responded with a brilliant and astonishing move that you cannot even imagine. I want you to pause the video and try to figure out that move. I'll give you 5 seconds to think. 1 2 3 4 5. If you dared to find rook to d4, then congratulations. You are absolutely correct and have the ability to become the next Mikhail Tal. First of all, the rook to d4 strategy involves blocking the bishop's diagonal on this king side. None of your knights or rooks can capture the rook because queen to g7 will ruin your position. Additionally, the knight also cannot capture the rook on d4 for the same reason. If you dare to capture the rook with your dark square bishop, I can easily grab your bishop on d4, threatening checkmate on g7, leaving your position completely vulnerable. For example, if you dare to play queen to f8 to try a queen exchange, I can respond with the blindfolded move knight to f6, checking the king and delivering a checkmate. It will be the last day for your knight, where I will give you a nightmare. If you play pawn to f5 to protect that rank, you know what. By playing pawn to f5, it unguards the pawn on g6, allowing me to easily capture the pawn, forcing the king to move. Then, knight to e6 check will attack the king, and the king will have no escape squares, forcing black to sacrifice her queen. I will win the game very quickly, you know what. Life is very easy when you use Stockfish or have a Stockfish-like brain, but inferior beings like a cockroachy in front of me, because their thought process is under my feet. Returning to the position, we saw that the rook is under attack by 3 pieces, but none of your pieces can capture the rook. It is a brilliant move that also blocks the bishop's diagonal, allowing queen to g7 to checkmate the black king very well. Seeing this position, LeelaZero plays pawn to f5 to protect that rank, so, I grab the pawn on g6, forcing the king to move. As the king moves, I follow with queen h6 check, and then knight f6 check comes to check the black king. The black king has no retreating square except one. If you dare to move the king to f7, it will be the final move of your game because knight to g5 will checkmate the black king. The game will be completely over. Returning to the position, Leela has to sacrifice the queen on f6 since she has no other option. After knight takes d4 to protect this structured pawn, I grab the knight and then the pawns on e6 and f5, then, I push my pawn on h3. You can see that I have 3 connected pawns, and this game is completely winning for me. A few moves later, we have bishop to h7 check. The king cannot go to h8 because bishop to g6 will follow, and the queen is protecting these squares. Thus, the king must move to g8, then, queen to h7 followed by queen f7 will be checkmate. So, after the king moves to f7 and the queen moves out to e3, it exerts pressure on the rook with both the bishop and queen. A couple of moves later, we have bishop takes e8, after the rook captures, my queen can easily come to b6 because the rook is no longer on that file. By playing queen b6, it exerts pressure on the king and bishop. I pick up the bishop, and a few moves later, I push the pawns and promote them into a new queen. With my 2 connected pawns, it is a completely winning position for me, and I win the game by checkmating her. What a beautiful game. I enjoyed it very much. By the way, I also share my chess content on another channel. On my other channel, Stockfish 16, the chess videos are 6 to 8 minutes long. If you're interested, you can subscribe to that channel. Wishing you all the best. Bye bye.